Our first speaker is Christoph Berner from the Universität Göttingen, and he is going to speak on the topic of the Exodus narrative between history and literary fiction. So please give him a welcome.
Thank you. First, I wish to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to present a paper here. My paper will consist of two major parts. First part on methodology and issues concerning the literary characteristics of the biblical account, and a second part which deals with a test case, and I've chosen the bondage motive, and I'm trying to show you something about the development of the bondage motive within the Exodus narrative as far as I see it. So first part, the literary characteristics of the biblical account. Despite the scarcity of external evidence, it is impossible to deny that the key points of the biblical account of the Exodus can be related to certain historical phenomena. Egyptian sources testify to the fact that nomadic groups from Palestine would migrate to Egypt during times of famine. Moreover, we can say with certainty that people of Semitic origin were enslaved by the Egyptians and forced to work at the construction sites. And finally, it may safely be assumed that occasionally a group of slaves tried to escape and was pursued by a company of Egyptian chariots. In the light of these and other congruities between the Egyptian sources and the biblical account, it is certainly imaginable that the latter reflects a historical reality. Yet, this alone is definitely no sufficient proof of the historicity of the Exodus events. The decisive question that needs to be answered before any reconstruction of historical issues may be undertaken, the decisive question concerns the literary character of the biblical account. Is it a reliable source based on ancient traditions about the Exodus, or rather a literary fiction which develops an idealized picture of Israel's origins from a much later point of view? Half a century ago, probably most biblical scholars would have argued in favor of the first option. At that time, the documentary hypothesis, according to which the Pentateuch consists of several old sources based in turn on reliable oral traditions, was still widely accepted. However, in recent years, the shortcomings of the documentary hypothesis have become more and more apparent. The alleged sources are often fragmentary and do moreover feature a considerable number of explicit literary interconnections, which makes it very unlikely that they should represent originally separate documents. In consequence, a number of scholars did not only abandon the paradigm of the documentary hypothesis, but at the same time decided to dispense with any kind of critical research in the literary development of the biblical text. The tangents and doublets which were previously explained through the assumption of different sources are either ignored by these scholars or they are interpreted as a specific of Israelite literature, for instance by Thomas Thompson, according to whom, quote, the traditional complex chain narrative is not an editorial or redactional structure, but a type of literature in its own right, one of the ways in which ancient Israel told long stories, unquote. In my opinion, simplistic models of this kind are highly questionable, as they widely ignore more than a century of critical scholarship and simply equate the present biblical text with ancient Israelite literature without adducing any evidence to support this claim. To avoid any misunderstanding, I wish to stress that a strictly synchronic approach to the Hebrew Bible is certainly a legitimate option, as long as one is interested in a reception aesthetic or similar perspective alone. Yet, it becomes problematic when the biblical text is used as a historical source, but its own literary history is not considered. The traces of this literary history are so evident that it must be regarded as a fact which cannot seriously be called into question. For instance, the basic distinction between the priestly and the non-priestly parts of the Pentateuch is a well-established result of biblical criticism, which remains a cornerstone for any Pentateuchal theory. We've already heard that. Yet despite the evident conceptual and theological differences between these two different literary spheres, the priestly and the non-priestly material, it is at the same time apparent that they have not developed independently from each other. Rather, it seems that there is a dialogue between the different literary voices, with the priestly text commenting on and revising parts of the non-priestly narrative, while other non-priestly passages already seem to react to priestly text. As an example, I would refer, for instance, to the story of the competition between Moses, Aaron, and the Egyptian sorcerers or priests. That would be, in my reading, a priestly retelling of a more original plague cycle, plague narrative, a pre-priestly plague narrative. And on the other hand, a good example for a post-priestly reaction to priestly concepts would be Exodus 4, for instance. We've already heard that as well. And I'm sorry to say that the Song of the Sea, of course, because this is, as I would say, and some others here as well, it seems to presuppose a combined narrative in Exodus 14 and seems to draw on that, but maybe we will not agree on this, so I won't elaborate on it any further. This phenomenon of literary interaction between priestly and non-priestly material calls for an interpretive model distinct from the one provided by the documentary hypothesis. It is best explained on the basis of the supplementary hypothesis, which describes the literary development of the Pentateuch as a sequence of successive expansions and/or reductions. This reduction historical approach, which has found most of its current supporters among European scholars, offers a completely new perspective on the literary development of the Pentateuch. It suggests that a considerable part of the non-priestly text does not represent elements of one or more ancient sources, but rather expansions of the priestly narrative from the post-exilic period. Moreover, the hermeneutics and editorial techniques employed by the scribes who created the respective expansions are already strikingly similar to what we know from the early reception history of the biblical text at Qumran. With a certain right, one might therefore speak of a continuous process of interpretation which commences with the redaction history of the biblical text itself and continues in its different versions, rewritings, and early commentaries. It goes without saying that this approach to the literary development of the Pentateuch does considerably reduce its value as a source for reconstructing the history of ancient Israel. It does, however, provide new insight into the intellectual history of those post-exilic circles who shaped the biblical picture of Israel's origins and thus created a collective memory which should determine the identity of early Judaism. Naturally, the literary development of the Exodus narrative is governed by the same hermeneutic principles and redactional dynamics, which can be traced throughout the Pentateuch. The present text of Exodus 1 to 15 is the result of a complex history of literary expansions, which all contributed to the gradual development of the narrative elements as well as their theological interpretation. To illustrate this model, one could freely choose any thematic aspect or literary unit within the Exodus narrative. Due to the limited time, I will focus on the different descriptions of the Egyptian bondage, not least because this issue is crucial for any historical reconstruction of the Exodus events. So, point 2, the different descriptions of the Egyptian bondage and their literary development. The tension between slavery and liberation dominates the entire plot of the Exodus narrative and may thus be labeled as the central leitmotif. Surprisingly, however, only few passages provide details concerning the nature of the Israelites' forced labor. Apart from the fairly elaborate account of Pharaoh increasing the Israelites' burden in Exodus 5, there's only a set of brief notes in Exodus 1:11 to 14 stressing different aspects of the tasks the Israelites were involved in. Over the last decades, there has been a highly controversial discussion concerning the interpretation of the respective verses from Exodus 1, especially of the place names Pithom and Ramesses mentioned in Exodus 1:11 and their historical implications. Yet, while the passage was extensively treated from a philological and archaeological point of view, the crucial issue of its literary history was often marginalized, if not ignored altogether. This is problematic for two reasons. Firstly, Exodus 1:11-14 are not the work of a single author, but consist of a non-priestly, verses 11 and 12, and a priestly part, verses 13-14. Secondly, the passages providing details on the Israelites' forced labor are only loosely connected to their given context, and it's therefore questionable whether they represent an original part of the text or a later addition. When we take a closer look at the non-priestly text in Exodus 1:11-12, it at once becomes apparent that the reference to the building of the store cities in 1:11b stands out from its immediate context and interrupts the argument in 1:11a and 12. And they set workmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built store cities for Pharaoh, Pithom, and Ramses. But the more they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread, so that they came to dread the Israelites. In the light of this literary evidence, it seems reasonable to follow the suggestion made by Donald Redford and many others, and to regard Exodus 1:11b as a later addition, which aims at providing a more specific picture of the forced labor of the Israelites. While 11a and 12 are most likely part of the pre-priestly narrative, it proves virtually impossible to determine the precise place of 1:11b in the literary history of the Exodus narrative. It stands fairly isolated. It might represent a fairly early addition from the 7th century, which should in any case be regarded as the terminus postquem for internal reasons such as the reference to the city Pithom and the use of the Akkadian loanword are miskenot. We just heard that from Thomas Römer. It must, however, not be overlooked that most biblical references to store cities belong to the chronistic literature. A post-exilic origin of Exodus 1:11b therefore remains an option that should not be dismissed too easily. Regardless of the precise origin of Exodus 1:11b, it is evident that the verse betrays a certain knowledge of text external realities. The places Pithom and Ramesses were not invented by an Israelite scribe. At the same time, it is evident that it was a scribe who introduced these place names into the Exodus narrative in order to highlight that the Israelites were involved in the building of the two cities. Similar attempts of establishing etiological connections between certain places and the early history of Israel are attested throughout the Pentateuch. As a rule, they may prove quite instructive for our understanding of the historical situation in which the text was written, but provide no reliable data to reconstruct the historical circumstances of the events narrated in the text. A similar skepticism is also advisable with regard to the details of the Israelites' forced labor provided by Exodus 1:13-14, the priestly text, although in this case the situation is slightly different, as there is no decisive evidence for a text external reference point. According to Exodus 1:14, the Israelite slaves were assigned to the production of bricks as well as different kinds of labor in the fields. It is often overlooked, and thus all the more important, that both aspects are first attested in the context of the priestly layer of the Exodus narrative. In consequence, they should first and foremost be addressed as parts of the priestly concept of the Egyptian bondage and not as first-hand historical information. However, the case is even more complex, as it is doubtful whether the specific details provided in Exodus 1:14 were originally part of the priestly text at all. In Exodus 6:9, the priestly writer only refers to the hard service, avodah kasha, while its details are no longer an issue. Moreover, at least the reference to the Israelite service in the fields in 1:14a beta shows clear traces of a secondary addition. It is only loosely appended to the previous sentence, and its connection to the preceding introduction of the forced labor is primarily realized through the resumptive clause in 1:14b. This resumptive clause rephrases the wording from 1:13 and thus reflects a typical editorial technique employed to integrate later additions into a given literary context. We would say it's a case of Wiederaufnahme. Without the secondary appendix in 1:14a beta b, the two verses show a perfect parallel structure, which is framed through the chiastic use of the term avad, respectively avodah, and this seems to be the leitmotif of this short passage. So when we look at it, the Egyptians made the Israelites serve with rigor, and they made their life bitter with hard service in mortar and brick. And then we have this addition, and with all kinds of service in the field, with all of their service with which they made them serve with rigor. One may certainly ask whether the reference to mortar and brick in Exodus 1:14a alpha could not represent a later addition as well. For instance, one might think of a secondary explication of the Israelites' forced labor in the light of Genesis 11:3, where the same building materials, mortar and brick, are mentioned. Yet, in the end, there's no conclusive evidence to support this claim, and it is therefore best to assume that it was the priestly writer who first expressed the idea that the Israelites used to work in mortar and brick. In contrast, the introduction of the field labor in 1:14a beta b should be regarded as a post-priestly addition, as I've tried to show. This naturally raises the question, what was its trigger? That the Israelites were forced to work in the fields is a blind motive which is never referred to again in the context of the Exodus narrative and beyond. At least, not explicitly. There is, however, a parallel which could prove relevant. Interestingly, the semantic field introduced in Exodus 1:14a beta recurs in the context of the hail plague in Exodus 9, where Pharaoh's servants, avadim, in the field, basadeh, are mentioned. Although the author of the passage had surely been thinking of Egyptian servants, the correspondence between the priestly term for the Egyptian bondage, avodah, allowed for a different reading as well. Read against the background of the priestly terminology, it was almost natural to conclude that the servants mentioned in Exodus 9 were in fact Israelite slaves. In my opinion, it is precisely this reading which has given rise to the post-priestly expansion in Exodus 1:14a beta and b. The idea that the Israelites were forced to work in the fields thus proves to be the result of inner biblical exegesis. So far, we have encountered three considerably different types of literary characterizations of the bondage motive in Exodus 1:11-14. While the notion of the Israelites working in mortar and brick was most likely introduced by the priestly writer and reflects his concept of the Egyptian bondage, the reference to the building of the store cities in Exodus 1:11b represents a secondary addition to the pre-priestly text motivated by an etiological interest. In contrast, the idea that the Israelites used to work in the fields shows no text external reference point at all, but proves to be the result of the exegetical reflections of a postexilic scribe. Of the three different characterizations of the Egyptian bondage established in Exodus 1:11-14, only one should have a discernible impact on the literary development of the Exodus narrative. The priestly notion of forced labor in mortar and brick recurs in Exodus 5, where Pharaoh orders that the Israelites' burden should henceforth be increased. That same day, Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters of the people, as well as their supervisors, "You shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks as before, let them go and gather straw for themselves. But you shall require of them the same quantity of bricks as they have made previously. Do not diminish it, for they are lazy. That is why they cry, let us go and sacrifice to our God. Let heavier work be laid on them, then they will labor at it and pay no attention to deceptive words." A close reading of the passage reveals that the author has made use of two key terms which are firmly rooted in the priestly layer. The author refers to the Israelites' labor as avodah, and furthermore elaborates on the motive that this labor was connected to the making of bricks, levinim. In short, Exodus 5 presupposes the priestly text in Exodus 1:13 and 14i alpha. This clearly speaks against the still widespread belief that Exodus 5 represents an early element of the Exodus narrative, which according to some even provides first-hand information on the historical situation of the Israelites in Egypt. Quite to the contrary, the text belongs to a post-priestly stage in the literary development of the Exodus narrative, as has been convincingly demonstrated by Jan Christian Gerz and others. If Exodus 5 represents a later edition, this naturally raises the question as to the main purpose of the story. Although the text significantly contributes to fleshing out the scarce description of the Israelite situation given in Exodus 1, it is certainly misconceived as a mere agadic embellishment. Rather, what the author in Exodus 5 was interested in the first place was to solve a tension that had emerged in the course of the literary development of the Exodus narrative. the tension results from the post-priestly narrative in Exodus 4, which aims to show that Moses managed to make the people believe in his message of deliverance by working miraculous signs. Now, this faith of the people, Exodus 4:31, stands in stark contrast to the disobedience with which they meet Moses' message, according to the priestly text, Exodus 6:9. In order to explain this sudden change of behavior of the formerly faithful people, the author of Exodus 5 has created a new situation by making Pharaoh increase the burden. The faith of the people is thus heavily unsettled, and it becomes understandable why the Israelites no longer want to listen to Moses. As a result, the motive of Pharaoh increasing the Israelites' burden must not be isolated from the purpose of Exodus 5 within the Exodus narrative. The motive does not provide insight into the historical situation of the Israelites prior to the Exodus, but rather represents the literary means which was chosen by the author of the chapter to establish a connection between the non-priestly and the priestly material. Thus, Exodus 5 is crucial for our understanding of the literary history of the Exodus narrative, but reveals nothing about the history of ancient Israel. Just some short conclusions.
Okay. You can give the conclusion.
Yeah. Just very, very briefly, I wish to stress that, quite elementary, that the biblical picture of the Egyptian bondage is a composite picture. And I've tried to show that it is composed of different literary voices, and these different literary voices stress different aspects, and they have different motivations. So we should rather regard this as a literary phenomenon and not try to reconstruct the history of what was going on. This does not mean that there is no historical core to the Exodus tradition, the bondage motive, whatever. I would just argue that this is lost, and we have to maintain a sharp distinction between what has been made out of this tradition in the biblical text and what may have been its historical origins. This is my last conclusion, does not mean that these biblical texts have no historical value whatsoever. They remain an important historical source, but not for reconstructing the history of ancient Israel, but rather for reconstructing the intellectual history of I would say, an emerging Judaism, which has created its own foundational myth in these texts. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for a question or two.
Konrad Schmid. Thank you. I would like to just add one observation regarding 111b with this mention of Pithom and Ramses, which always has been very important for a historical evaluation for the Exodus. I think it probably will remain debated whether 111b is an addition in its context or not, but I think within the formulation of the building of the Arei Miskenot, there is a tension itself, which I think is important, because Arei Miskenot is in the Hebrew text now indeterminate. It's not determined. But in the end, it says, et Pithom et Ramses. And if you translate this actually precisely, then it would say that the Israelites built storage cities, among them Pithom and Ramses, if you somehow take into account the non-determination of the Arei Miskenot and the determination of Pithom and Ramses as proper nouns. And this is probably not the meaning of the text. Usually, I think if this should be a smooth text, it would have to be expected that the storage cities would be named Arei HaMiskenot. And this might be a hint that B111b, an addition or not, that at least et Pithom et Ramses might be a historizing addition or a gloss in order to somehow add a little bit more color to the description of the oppression.
Thank you for this. I've got this in my book, this distinction within this verse. I didn't want to torture you with it, so I left it out. But of course, you're right. There, it's somehow awkward. And maybe one should add that the Septuagint goes one step further and adds Heliopolis to this list. So we can see that there has been evidently an interest in trying to locate these different cities.
Sorry to give you the hook.
I'm
Sorry.
leaving. I'm
okay,
leaving.
that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, give him a warm applause.